educación podría ser que todos tenemos capacidades diferentes, todos podemos tener un don diferente, podemos lograr metas que tal vez nunca las pensamos, pero para mí es como tener tu mayoría de dedicación en tu estudio, saber organizar tu tiempo para así tener un desempeño en tus clases más satisfactorio para ti, para tu familia y para las personas que te rodean. Pues para mí el acceso a la educación podría ser que todos tenemos capacidades diferentes, todos podemos tener un don diferente, podemos lograr metas que tal vez nunca las pensamos, pero para mí es como tener tu mayoría de dedicación en tu estudio, saber organizar tu tiempo para así tener un desempeño en tus clases más satisfactorio para ti, para tu familia y para las personas que te rodean.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final serious event of CADF 2021. This session will be conducted in English, so I would like to take a moment to invite those who prefer to participate in Spanish to take advantage of the live interpretation. Reconozco que esta es una de las pocas sesiones que estaremos haciendo en inglés, así que doy una bienvenida especial a las y les hispanohablantes, y para ustedes que prefieren escuchar en español, les invito a hacer clic en el link abajo para una interpretación simultánea de la conversación. My name is Kim McLean, and I am the Regional Director for the Americas at Global Fund for Children, a public foundation based in Washington, D.C. that supports child and youth-focused grassroots organizations with flexible funding, trust-based relationships, capacity development support, and building connections to strengthen their work and expand their impact. Over the past 6 months, Kathy Hall of the Summit Foundation and Caroline Cronley of the Tinker Foundation have become co-conspirators with me in raising the alarm and encouraging funders to look seriously at the epic catastrophe unfolding right now in the education sector in Central America. School is something we can all relate to, but somehow we've been lulled into trusting that public education will always just be there to underpin almost every other aspect of society, democracy, culture, health, the economy, security, and on and on. And now for so many kids in Central America, it's barely there, if at all, and it hasn't been there now for almost 2 full school years. So we're really grateful to CADF for giving education the spotlight in this closing plenary. And now I'd like to introduce first Nora Lustig, the Samuel Z. Stone Professor of Latin American Economics and the founding director of the Commitment to Equity Institute, at Tulane University. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, the Center for Global Development, and the Inter-American Dialogue. She's a founding member and president emeritus of the Latin America and Caribbean Economic Association, member of the editorial board of the Journal for Economic Inequality, and president-elect of the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality, being the first woman elected to this leadership role. Needless to say, her research on economic development, inequality, and social policies emphasizing Latin America has been foundational to the field, for more than a couple decades. So Nora, you've spent your career thinking about inequality in Latin America and how it affects the playing field for future generations. From your recent research, what has been the impact of school closures in Latin America from an equity lens, particularly Central America?
Yes, thank you, Kimberly. Buenas tardes. Voy a hablar en inglés porque me pidieron, pero el español es mi idioma natal. Bueno, I think that, it might be interesting to just give you a little bit of perspective that although it's not often known, but Latin America experienced, including Central America, a decline in inequality in the first decade of the century that petered off before the pandemic. And the decline in inequality was also accompanied since the 1990s with social mobility, particularly educational mobility. There had been progress. And in fact, educational expansions were one of the driving forces for this decline in inequality. So it was a very nice story that it's coming to an end. And we are facing a situation in which we might actually see a very strong reversal. And I'm delighted that this panel is actually focusing on the issue of the crisis of education, because I think globally, the lasting scar of COVID is likely to be what is the consequences of school closures on the children of the next generation, and maybe the children of the next generation as well, because these patterns tend to be persistent. So I just want to show you a few numbers. I mean, I know we have very little time, but I just want to whet your appetite to sort of put this in perspective. And let me see here. Okay, so the pandemic shock can be seen as producing two major negative impacts on people's living standards. One is through the lockdowns and people's responses to them. Those are the short-term impacts. They affect incomes. And we've seen in most countries, inequality and poverty has been on the rise, very much so in Latin America, but not just. But we also saw that a lot of the social assistance policies that were implemented during the crisis in some countries were able to actually mitigate the negative short-term impacts quite a bit. And that was a surprise because a lot of people thought that given the large informal sectors in Latin America, it was going to be very hard to actually deploy safety nets so quickly. But it was possible, and I think we learned a lot from that as well. The other shock or the other negative effect will come through something that has not been mitigated really, and that's the one I like to focus on. It's the impact on school closures on human capital, and through human capital on intergenerational mobility. The education policies that have been implemented to mitigate the effect on the growing gap in human capital have not been really successful. And therefore, actions need to be put in place as soon as possible to remediate this. And I hope that everybody that's part of this discussion and funders are very well aware that this is a task of great urgency. And I'm going to show you a few numbers. As the economy recovers, we will see that the short-term impacts probably will be reversed, but not necessarily the long-term impacts. And what we have done with my collaborators that are in different parts of the world actually is to try to sort of nowcast what the impact of school closures may mean, particularly on average schooling years and also high school completion rates. And to distinguish the effect by socioeconomic background of the families of where children live. And what we see is that there's tremendous inequity in terms of the possibility of children from poorer families to replace formal schooling by some form of homeschooling compared to children that come from families of the middle class, the upper middle class, or the rich. And so what we'll probably see is an increase in dropout of schooling, and the many children will have lower achievements, which will translate into lower intergenerational mobility, a future higher inequality of opportunity, and probably a future higher wage inequality, which is what I was saying initially. The progress that we found in the past might be erased. So, this is just one graph that shows you the inequality, for example, in access to connectivity. I put arrows on Salvador and Guatemala. The green bars reflect access to connectivity for families of different parental educational background. And as you can see, the illiterate, which are the extreme left of these bars, are very low access to connectivity compared to those that have tertiary education, which are at the top and have 100%. So that's one of the reasons why children of families with lower socioeconomic background are likely to be in a disadvantaged position, but it's not the only one and may not be the most important one. I think one of the most important factors that distinguishes the groups of children by different socioeconomic background is the ability of receiving the mentorship and coaching that children from highly educated parents can obtain compared to those who are in families that have very little education. So what does it mean when we look at our exercise of nowcasting? It's, for Central America, I was looking at these numbers and I said, it's pretty terrible. These bars here show you the red ones, both the light and dark red, and the green ones, both the light and the dark green, reflect children from with parents. The first one's parents with less than secondary education. The green ones with in families with secondary education or more. And the light versus the solid or darker ones compare the pre-pandemic with the post-pandemic. So what you can see in general is that while there was quite a significant gap in the likelihood to complete high school, depending on which family you were born into before the pandemic, so compare Guatemala, the light red with the light green, the gap was there. The gap increased significantly with the COVID shock. In most of the countries, children that were born to families that have highly educated parents are able to relatively replace schooling by homeschooling. For children that live in families with low socioeconomic background, that ability is curtailed. So we see this gap growing in all the places, but in Central America, the rates were already pretty low. So in Guatemala and in El Salvador and in Honduras is actually one of the worst, children who are born to families with parents with less than completed high school will probably face a likelihood of completing secondary education that's below 10%, which is quite dismal. So what does it mean overall for the region? Over time, this is, if you look at the cohorts going from the children that were born in the 1940s to children that were born in the early 2000s, the trend had been for the rate of high school completion to between children of low socioeconomic background and children from high educated parents' households to narrow over time. Well, what we're going to see now with the results of our analysis is that narrowing will stop, and actually the gap will increase based on our research by about 15 percentage points. This is what would have happened without the pandemic, the dashed lines, and this is what the pandemic might entail. So I want to conclude with the message that remedial actions are urgent and they have to be implemented as soon as possible. Otherwise, we're buying decades of inequity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nora, for giving us such a wake-up call to the really pernicious and devastating effects of this education crisis on inequality in a region that has been fighting so hard to dig itself out from such a problematic reality. And so as we continue our conversation with two distinguished leaders in this field, I also would like to invite everyone who's joining us today to think about how your organization might contribute to the resilience of the Central American education systems, and to share your thoughts via Mentimeter at the link that's posted now in the chat. And in a few minutes, we'll also share with you a link to see live the contributions of your fellow participants. We want to inspire you to keep thinking about what this might mean for your organization and how you might add your grain of sand, your granito de arena. But I'm very excited to introduce Maritza Trejo and Angel del Valle, both practitioners, advocates, leaders in regional organizations seeking lasting change for vulnerable children and youth. Maritza Trejo is the Regional Education Director at Glasswing International. She has worked extensively designing and implementing education and development programs for vulnerable and at-risk women, children, and youth in Central America and the US. She currently oversees the design, planning, and implementation of Glasswing's school-based, volunteer-led after-school programs and other violence prevention initiatives in Central America, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. Angel del Valle is the country representative for the Population Council's Guatemala office and is a senior research officer. He is an anthropologist who has worked in social research on gender, human rights, indigenous people, social movements, prevention of gender-based violence, and social inclusion. He specializes in anthropological approaches to social research and has led experimental and qualitative evaluations of programs designed to empower girls in Mesoamerica and the Caribbean. Maritza, Angel, it's great to be back speaking with you again, and this stage is most definitely yours as practitioners, as advocates in Central America. In light of the picture that Nora has painted for us, will you start off by sharing an example of an action that your organization has taken to address this education crisis during the pandemic and a major challenge that you see ahead of you? Maritza, I'll pass the mic to you first.
Thank you, Kimberly. It's really an honor to be here and be part of this conversation, joined, of course, with Angel and Nora. It is upsetting and sad panorama, but hopefully, we also can gather the support and ideas to move us forward. As you know, and as Nora painted the picture, even before the pandemic, there were a lot of challenges in the education sector in the region, although there had been some progress, right? And that's what Nora mentioned too, that we're concerned about the recession of that reversal of those progress that have been made, even in enrollment rates. And it is very concerning to think about how much of that progress will be reversed. Also, schools play an important role as an agent of socialization, and in particular for the youth that we work with. Schools become safe havens, and sometimes they're the only place, where they can feel value, they can be seen, and they can receive some of the support that might not be accessible at homes. So when COVID-19 started and schools, closed, our team and our volunteers, we quickly adapted all of our programming for youth and families to allow them to have a sense of normalcy, to have that sense of connection, because a lot of the students were just really concerned and were missing, that part of connection with their peers. So all of our after school programs, we were able to adapt it to an online platform, Facebook, which became En Casa con Glasswing, and that's where we were able to provide all of our programming. And we also multiply our efforts providing academic and mental health support, because that was the immediate need that we saw that not only students, but the parents and also teachers were needing. And also we provided a lot of stipends for internet access. Even now, it's about 5,000 students that we are helping with internet access, because like Nora mentioned in her presentation, the access to connectivity, even if there are in their areas, there's access to connectivity. Students don't have, and their families don't have the resources to be able to, have daily access to data. So that's a lot of the focus that we did. To the question about challenges ahead, as we've heard from many of the sessions this week, there are many, many challenges, but there also can be opportunities to innovate and do more. One of this, and as Nora mentioned, will be how can we recover the learning loss and also recover the well-being of our students and also of the teachers and the families of the students. Having been confined at home, isolated from their friends, and some of the students confronted also loss of dear family members and friends due to COVID-19. They've gone through a lot of stress. And to the point, about the academic loss, talking to a lot of the students that are now facing a lot of stress, because they're very concerned about their future. They're concerned about the future of their little brothers and sisters who are now in 3rd and 4th grade and don't know how to read. And that's very, very concerning for them, and adding to that stress and trauma that they already had before the pandemic. So that's the main challenge that we have. I think, mental health support needs to be included in all of the interventions that we do in schools, and not just think about the students, but also think about the teachers and the families.
Thank you so much, Maritza. I think it's easy for us to think mostly about the academic side, but the reality is that without that environment of just a sense of safety, a sense of kind of a basic emotional well-being, it's going to be very hard for students to come back, and to think of how traumatic this pandemic has been from all angles for students, parents, teachers, everyone. I think is really critical. Angel, I'd pass the mic to you with the same questions. Tell us about what Population Council has been doing and one of the challenges you really see ahead of us.
Well, thank you for having me. And, a special recognition to colleagues at the Global Fund, Tinker and Summit for addressing the urgent need to tackle the education crisis that we're seeing. I'm going to speak from the disadvantaged children that Nora was just talking about. Over the past 17 years, the Council has been working at the intersection of age, gender, location, residence, and ethnicity, which led us to focus our attention on Indigenous adolescent girls ages 8 to 17. And as early as April last year, households were reporting loss of income and lack of access to health, hospitals, medicines as their main concerns to cope with the pandemic. So we knew that due to poverty and exclusion that affects these communities, the pandemic was going to have a disproportionate effect on education. These burdens from exclusion were going to affect mainly adolescent girls. So usually, and as Maritza was saying, the school is the one place where girls can learn, play, be with other girls, be with other role models. And once confinement started, and schools continue to be closed in some places around the country, girls lost that social connectivity that translated to significant losses in social capital. And so, usually in these communities, once girls drop out of school as young as age 12, we usually see them again in clinics for prenatal care. And not only that is a tragedy, but the confinement is now extended to other dimensions of life. And so the immediate action that we took was reaching them at their houses, going door to door, trying to collect information on what they actually need, and some basic enrollment information that we could then bring to the health sector, to the education sector, and advocate to do something about it. And when I say we, I mean the teams of young Indigenous women that work as mentors. And that's the other key element of the work that we do, that these role models, these tutors, these teachers that we support have access to the community on a regular basis, speak the language, and know the resources that girls need. So once we geared up to go to communities, go from door to door, the immediate need that girls were describing to us was the need to have a safe space to meet outside the household, where they could do homework, where they could gain some of that connection to friends that they usually had. And so we are currently building on that experience. And as Maritza said, basic needs are also driven by the lack of skills that their parents have, because in these communities, their parents, mothers mainly, that spend the day with them, have on average 1.8 years of education. And they are pretty much monolingual, so the capacities that they have to support the remote learning are limited. So now the challenge remains on how we will bring actors to the table using the information that we collected, raising the needs of adolescent girls, to discuss how we're going to reopen schools safely, which is connected to the challenge that we have with the slow vaccination efforts in the country.
Absolutely, Angel. I think it's some of the really important things you mentioned around that intersectionality of what it means to be Indigenous, what it means to be a girl, what it means to be an adolescent, what it means to live in poverty, especially rural poverty, and all of that coming together. And I think this, one of the things you mentioned, kind of really getting all the way to those kids, getting to them at home, kind of taking those last mile approaches, right, to actually reaching them, but also not reinforcing the confinement, actually pulling them back out into the world is really, really critical, I think, to safety and to inspiring opportunities for the future. I'd really like us to jump right into talking about the role of philanthropy in all of this. So my questions really are, what contributions will the region need from philanthropy to at least get to an acceptable level of recovery in education? And are there like more creative contributions that you would ask of donors who may not articulate education as an objective within their own strategies? I'll leave it open. I don't know who would like to speak up first, but Maritza, Angel, really let's make this a conversation now that we've all been introduced.
To mention, so I'll start with the first one and then we can keep the conversation going. I think, as I mentioned before about the challenge, the first thing that we need is help teachers they're going to require special support to ensure that they have the necessary tools and the necessary materials to be able to support the students as we transition to face-to-face classes. Like Angel said, a lot of the students are still receiving classes remotely, even in El Salvador, which schools open around April. It's only about 20% of actual students that are attending the schools. So, as we prepare for this transition, teachers will need that extra support. And this will not only be for the social emotional issues that students and the teachers themselves will bring to the schools, but also, as we mentioned before, the academic needs, the recovery of learning. So these will require a special help with, new education innovations and also social emotional initiatives.
Yes, I would agree with Maritza. And, I would add that connections between health and education are critical. And especially connections to vaccination efforts that are, progressing slowly in our region. And those will be determinant factors to reopen schools safely. Just to give you an example, we were at a workshop a couple of days ago in the northern region part of the country in a rural Indigenous community. And we heard from health practitioners who run the local clinics that misinformation, the lack of information that Indigenous communities and rural communities and overall communities have about the vaccine and about how the pandemic is evolving and what it means is also driving them away from other health resources that they were receiving, particularly school meals. So there are some parents, because they're hesitant of the impact that the vaccine will have, are no longer supporting not only school meals, but other sorts of medicines that were provided. And all of this is happening at the same time. And there's only limited capacity in what schools and the health sector can do. But what struck me the most is that they were not talking to each other. In this particular region, health and education were not sitting with the municipal government, with parent organizations, which are crucial to mobilize children, to think of ways in which we can help support both efforts, the vaccination efforts and how we will reopen schools safely. And I think that's a gap that we need to fill urgently, and it will take a village, because definitely one organization will not be able to pull together the advocacy that we need to make local and central governments wake up to the urgency.
That's so true, and very worrisome, because as Angel says, I hear a lot of rumors still spreading from students and from their parents, not wanting to get the vaccine. So, anyone that has some platforms where they can, help to disseminate the right information so students and families can vaccinated, that quickly we'll be able to reopen. And I think also there's also need to be direct assistance to schools, so that they can implement context-appropriate health and hygiene protocols. There's been all these protocols created in each of our countries, and there's requirements so that schools can become certified so they can reopen. But a lot of the schools just really don't have the resources to be able to do this. And so a lot of the parents are not going to send their students to the schools unless they feel safe that once their kids get to the schools that they will be able to have that protection.
So Kimberly, I think that thank you very much for sharing the experiences, Angel and Maritza. I hope that I can follow up with you then on the side later, and with lots of people that are participating in this event on the ground. Experience on the ground is so valuable. But it seems to me, and I don't know whether out of this event, you will come up with a sort of a strategy approach on how to face this in a systemic way. I don't think that, as valuable as all the sort of isolated or, and as many as you may have efforts that are very focused only on particular things in a particular school in a particular town will actually do the trick given the size of the challenge that we're facing. So there has to be an integrated approach that involves the various parts of society, government, the philanthropic side, that there's the philanthropy that works on the ground, and then there's the other one that supports research or activities through financial support. The private sector as well has to be brought in because, for example, I think the connectivity issue perhaps could be solved more easily if you had the private sector, the business, the for-profit, putting their philanthropic hat for a while to try to sort of expand connectivity very quickly. But it has to be, somebody has to think about this in terms of a strategy, where the binding constraints are, where are the synergies, how do you integrate all the actors so that the effect will be what we need it to be. And my concern is that there's lots of activities happening throughout, but I don't see where this, integrated approach is going to come from. And I think that there are still many untapped resources that probably an integrated approach would allow. Mm-hmm. I also would like to invite people just to be vigilant of what's going to happen on the economic policy side. It's very important to be protective, if you want, of education and health spending. Now that countries will face the reining in of fiscal deficits, they were allowed to increase their fiscal deficits during the pandemic, even by the IMF, which is unusual. But that's going to come to an end. And as they have to implement some fiscal consolidation policies, we have to be very, very mindful that the sectors that have to be protected are not affected. So that is something that even, in the radar screen of everybody that's participating here should be one of the elements to be bear in mind.
Yeah, Nora, thanks for making that point. I think there is that one side of philanthropy can contribute with some direct action. I think we've seen a lot of where government has failed at the large scale. Civil society has had to step in lots of creative ways. Even if that's not the optimal solution, it has definitely been the coping mechanism. And there's a need for that to not lose an entire generation. But I think it's also important to remind ourselves, of course, that government is the legal guarantor. The state is the legal guarantor of children's right to education. So part of what both civil society and philanthropy does with this has to focus on also influencing and advocating with government. So Maritza and Angel, I want to ask you a little bit about that side of things. Like what do you feel needs to be advocated for? What actions do students and their families need from their governments so that we can address this on a more large scale that is beyond the reach of the small efforts that we're all desperately doing to keep things afloat?
Well, I just adding to what Nora just recently said, I was happy to see that Ojo con mi pisto just won the award, because accountability is critical, and evidence-based allocation of resources is very much needed in times where civil society has a lot of mistrust in government. And we just saw in the past months that the resources that needed to get to communities didn't get there on time. And not only that, we continue to miss the opportunity to do something in these months that are going to be critical to enrollment next year. So November, December, January, February are going to be key to mobilize communities, to mobilize teachers, to try to push for campaigns for re-enrollment and try to rescue learning. And we don't see that happening. And so, besides the co-allocation of resources, I believe we need to get creative at the spaces where children can learn and adolescents can learn. I think there's going to be a big need to rethink, reframe alternative education programs, distance education programs, the resources that are already allocated to those. And again, the pushing need to connect the dots between information, vaccines, and education. Otherwise, schools are just not going to be open soon.
Thanks, Maritza.
Yes, one of the things that Angel mentioned, and it's a phrase that's very common, but I think it really calls for the action that we all need to come together, because it would really take a village and beyond the borders of Central America to help address all of the challenges that we're facing right now. I think for us, and we need to be, thinking creatively about, regardless of whether you're the focus of your interest or your philanthropical interest might be on environment or economic recovery or job opportunities. We all go back to education. It's all related into education. So there are ways that we can work together again across sectors to bring these solutions. And for us, I think one of the immediate needs, and Nora mentioned it, will be how can we recover the learning loss? So remedial programs, and how can we advocate for governments so they prioritize. There are some evidence-based already initiatives that have proven to be effective, helping kids, level up their academic learning, and especially focus on those basic competencies of math and reading, because, even before the pandemic, we saw that the biggest, at least in El Salvador, from the data in El Salvador, a lot of the kids started dropping out when they're in 6th and 7th grade, when it becomes a lot more challenging academic school. And if they didn't have those foundations in math and reading, that's when they start getting frustrated, and a lot of them just stop going to school. And so it's really concerning if we don't do something to address that now. What's going to be the future, for our region? All of the progress that we have been making in different areas, can be very devastating. And so, and also, I want to also bring that it's not just the remedial education. Like you mentioned before, we also have to think about mental health, because the type of stress, the type of trauma that has been increased through the pandemic is also going to have long-lasting effects, and we also need to be addressed that. So it's not one or the other. We need to do both, and we need to also think about not just the students, but also the teachers.
And if I may add quickly, there was a session earlier today that discussed domestic workers and the expectation behind it, the lack of certainty that they have to access their rights. And children, and particularly adolescent girls, dropped out last year. So this year were looking for opportunities, and some of them are pursuing the path of domestic work. This means that we have adolescent girls as young as 10, 12, 13, 14 moving. And I think we need to broaden our idea of how to tackle migration and how to support migration efforts, given the attention it has, given the relevance we all think it has. But this current crisis is already creating a lot of mobility. That's not the safest. adolescents lack information. Once they leave the community, they are already doing it. And not only do we need to get better at tracing that, at securing safe ways for them to do it, but also to be intentional. If we understand intersections, if we have evidence around not only how different factors intersect, but also what's driving, not only a school dropout, but also, as Maritza was mentioning, the loss of learning. If there was ever a moment where we need to get intentional, it's now. And I think the flexibility that some organizations are providing to partnering with local communities, leaders, is going to be important, but also commitments to long-term investments. Ideally, hopefully, to cohorts. If we are able to work with children, with adolescents, we need to remember that it's not a homogeneous work, and we need to make the difference, the distinctions between what happens across life stages, particularly for those that are younger, ages 10 to 14, and particularly for those that dropped out last year and are trying to find their way this year.
Thank you, Angel. I think this really speaks to it speaks to the complexity of all of this, but also how all of these pieces are going to weave together. Migration is weaving with the economic situation, is weaving into the education crisis, is weaving into the health crisis, and all of those pieces. I think we need, finding a way to articulate that better, so that policymakers, so that governments, so that large-scale donors, so that cooperation, so these folks who can actually make these large-scale strategic decisions really understand how all this fits together, and don't simply assume that, well, this is not a moment for education as a thing. There's other issues. It's all very much connected. And I think to Nora's point at the beginning that some of the immediate effects of this, we might be able to recover quickly, but the long-term effects of the loss of human capital will be devastating. And we can see the train wreck ahead of us. And because we can see it, we need to do something about it. We're going to continue this conversation. I want to put an invitation out to those who are listening to please throw some comments and some questions into the chat. We would love to take some time to answer some questions. Maritza, Angel, Nora, I know are very interested in being able to respond to what's on your minds, and also invite you to continue to put your ideas into the Mentimeter. I think it will be a very inspiring space for us.
So Kim, can I say something also?
Please.
If you have recommendations for us, I mean, in what can we do? I mean, me, I'm a professor on delay, but what can we do? I mean, it'd be interesting also to get some feedback because, I want to also participate in the remedial actions myself, not just putting the problem in front of everybody, but what can we do where we stand?
Absolutely. I think we've all struggled between we need to raise alarm bells, but also we have to be able to propose those solutions of what can each of us do. And as much as it can be frustrating to see lots of little things, the reality is the more little things we can become aware of and connect with each other, hopefully we can build that strategic response. Yeah.
I wanted to add, because there's so many ways that we can get involved, right? And depending on the institution that you represent, but even at the personal level. One of the things that I've been impressed more than we already were about how youth are very hungry, for learning and meeting new people from different parts of the world. So one of the regalos that I like to say of this pandemic, in spite of all the negative things that has happened, is that for us and our programs and in our schools, we have about 15,000 youth in all of the region that participate in our programs, that we were able to connect them through different types of online programming, whether it was cooking classes, art classes, English classes. So, there's the opportunity also to engage volunteers from all over the world if they want to teach Portuguese, if they want to teach French. We have, all of the different types of opportunities. So, as you work towards how to bring your organization and help, bring these challenges, also, start with something little, volunteer for a remedial club or teach a language class to one of our students, because right now, they're looking for those opportunities to continue to engaging in learning.
Yeah, there's kind of this dual situation of we know that the digital solutions are not going to work for all children, and yet so many youth just don't feel the barriers that we do to just being in a virtual space. They can feel it just as social and as engaging as in-person experiences. So it's kind of a yes and to all of that. So we do have some questions coming in from those who are listening. And I want to put two of them out there quickly, and you can kind of answer both as ideas comes to you. One is around the ideas that you might have for educational opportunities for those who are already on the move, children who are already part of this migration journey and migration experience in the region. And the other is just experiences you've had of interacting with government, whether that's national or local, to try to address some of these problems. What are you finding in your engagements with government?
Well, I can tell you for sure that we need to strengthen our understanding of social protection. So when we talk about mobility for adolescents, we just think of the drivers that are affecting their lives and why is it that they move. But we need to prepare and equip for that mobility because it's going to continue to happen, particularly in this situation. I'm talking about mobility from one city to the other, from one town to the other. Because as we progress through the pandemic, the aspiration gets more demanding. These adolescents, these children want to be enrolled in school. They want to pursue their education. So if the aspiration exists, then it's the social protection system that's failing. And that is a very hard message to get if you are an indigenous children, if you are rural children or peri-urban children, that opportunities are there, but not to you, that you have to work the hardest to get those. And that's something that's thinking that we need to reverse. And although there are efforts to try to strengthen that idea of social protection, intersectionality is still something that's often missing in the picture. And evidence to make decisions. I think we cannot stress enough that we know what will happen. We can make projections. And as Nora was saying, we can make the connections to the wider macro events that are going to drive our reality in the coming years. But we just need to be sensitive that we have the largest group of adolescents growing up and that we are not only failing to their aspirations, but also failing to meet the urgency of the moment. And something as simple as getting better at our theory of change, getting better at how we connect the dots, and meeting them where they are can make a total difference.
And to the question about how we're partnering with governments, I think it's crucial. We must work with governments. We have to understand and talk to them, engage with them to understand what are the priorities, what are the strategies, and see how we can align. And I think when we align our priorities also with the priorities of the government, which should be aligned with the needs actually of the students, we can find that ground to work together and keeping constant communication, transparency. Although it's difficult, I know in some countries more than others, and we kind of sometimes have to figure out ways to do it. And there's different levels of government, right? So there's one type of communication that you do with the higher level of authority of government, but there's also the technical team and the school officials who to see the direct need. And I think, it's able to have influence at those different levels that we're able to have that impact that we need to.
Yeah, and one of the other questions that followed up on that is kind of who can we talk to in government that's going to be able to actually influence this? And I think that's actually it's an important question in the context of governance in Central America. I know, for example, in the case of Honduras, there has been this tension between the education ministries and the emergency response ministries who are in charge of COVID protocols, right? And who has the actual authority to open schools has been kind of a real question there. So kind of where have you seen that the leverage points are within government, and who can we bring onto our team to actually influence the governments of Central America, who we know are, it's not as straightforward, I think, as we would hope.
It's not, and I mean, it depends also in every country, it's different. And like I said, for us, it's having the same conversation over and over again with different people at different levels, you know, and sometimes you find the right channel. Although in El Salvador, a lot of it is being centralized right now. And so in a way, you know, that makes it easier, but at the end of the day, you know, you need to know the communities where you're going to be working. And you know, if the principal of the school, he or she will be the one who will let you in or not into their school. So I think it's very important for us being community-based organizations to have that commitment, you know, on, like Angel said, on the long term to engage with these communities. And, you know, and that's the first thing. And then, so to get the approvals and everything else, it really, it's like a maze. You have to learn how to navigate it and talk to different people, but the more also support that we engage from donors, you know, big foundations or other international cooperation, that can send a clear message to governments about what the priorities should be. So right now, remedial education, mental health, there's a lot of funding coming from those donors to those programs, and the governments are listening. They do pay attention that, you know, that's where we need to prioritize some of the initiatives.
And I would add that coordination bodies already exists. You know, you already exist. The spaces exist, and what they usually need is to hear from organizations that are closer to communities what the needs are. And everyone's busy. I think, you know, the pandemic has everyone sitting in front of the computer all day trying to figure out what to do if there's an emergency, if there's a crisis. But you know, it's not that complicated to look at the evidence that's available. But it's also important for us to realize that research utilization in the region has always been challenging. And the amount of information that's flowing can be overwhelming for these decision makers. Yeah. So if we're able to streamline the message that we bring to them, if we're able to streamline the data and what it means and what the projection, the impact that the projections will have in enrollment and the impact that will have on our economies, for example, then they start to listen and think differently and start to take action. Right, so I think it's a combination of both, bringing the reality of what children and adolescents are living and streamlining the evidence that's available.
I think that's a really good point, Angel. And I think this is where those of you who are listening that maybe are not thinking about education as primary to your strategy, but if you're thinking about free press, if you're thinking about transparency, if you think about behavioral change communications, if those are areas of expertise you have, that I think that this is one of those topics that needs that full court support to build the political will that's needed to actually respond to this and to get that clarity of message through to policymakers that are being bombarded by so many things right now. And I think also even to private sectors, you mentioned those who provide the access to bandwidth, to access to the internet for potential students. And I want to throw out just one more question as we're wrapping up, which I think really speaks to this idea of we've all been kind of inspired by the potential for technology and seen how quickly that has leapfrogged forward. But I guess some of the question is, what have we learned about how much transfers from real life to online? And do we think, to what extent do we think these hybrid models of education that are both kind of in-person / online might remain? Is that going to be something that's an opportunity to grow, or is that actually going to challenge us and continue to challenge us in issues of inequality going forward?
It's definitely a challenge, and unless we start investing in trying to really close that gap of access and connectivity in our communities, if we don't do that first, if we start just focusing on increasing or keeping hybrid and online exclusive education modalities, then we're going to increase also the gap of inequality that exists in our community. So we first need to address that gap. But I do hope that, we keep some of these innovations, like I said before, and in terms of our student population, 88% of our students connect to whatever online programming we have available through a mobile phone. I mean, I don't know. It amazes me the things that they can do with a phone, and how they still keep engaging, despite not being very comfortable to engaging a learning activity. And like I said, it allows us also for this connectivity to bring kids from the Dominican Republic to speak to kids from Guatemala, from El Salvador, from Honduras. And I think that's also brings all of the other benefits, for their own learning and for society as well. So in terms of lessons learned, I think there's a lot of that we are still learning, but we need to keep innovating and again finding ways to address those gaps in access and connectivity.
And I would stress the point that Nora made before, that there's tremendous inequity in these regions, and so we cannot expect we're going to be able to bring our kids and children on board with technology and connectivity without the private sector, because it heavily relies on the private sector. The way they are connected to internet now, the way they access it. So as if we are able to come up to the challenge and respond with a driving policy that integrates what each sector can do, I'm hoping that then all of these gains that Maritza was talking about that should stay are not only going to be sustained, but scaled to reach all children and adolescents despite the disadvantages that they face today.
Nora, I want to just come back to you for a moment, having listened to a bit of this practitioner conversation and knowing the frustration of not feeling that, and this is what we all feel, that there isn't a really strategic overall response right now. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of this conversation and where this takes you at the end. You need to unmute yourself.
I didn't mute myself, so yeah, it's encouraging to hear the initiatives that Maritza and Angel were sharing, and there may be other things that people who are part of this event, as we have discussed today, will realize that even, like you said, even if they're not working in the area of education, they can do things that are very complementary to actually be able to tackle with the problem. I still think that there. I mean, what Angel suggested about streamlining the message, both in terms of what will happen if you don't do anything. I mean, you can use our graph and say this is, what the future may look like. You're going to have children that were born in the 2000s have high school completion rates that were experienced by children that were born in the 1960s. So 4 decades going backward, that's a very powerful message. That, of course, has impact, as Angel was pointing out, on growth, inequity, social stability also. I mean, the fact that you have a regression in terms of education may exacerbate polarization and affect also social stability. If you have fewer opportunities in the future, that will be put even more strain in terms of migratory flows. So I think if you send a few messages that are very, very sobering and true, I mean, it's not an exaggeration, I think you're going to catch people's attention. Then is what to do. And there's where I don't see yet a clear message. Where do you start? What are the priorities where you need to have action? Who should be in charge of leading the different actions? And I think that's, at least, for me, I am not on the ground and I'm not looking at that. But for me, I still, that's a big question mark for me. I can, tell you about the diagnostic and send you very powerful messages, but I'd like to see the same in terms of what is it that we can do to make a difference in a systemic way, not just at the granular level, if you want.
Absolutely. I think for all of us, that part of why we're raising the alarm bells is, again, we would look to the state, who has, again, that responsibility to take some leadership in this, and not feeling that there is a commitment with many of our Central American governments to do so is a scary prospect.
I mean, shouldn't we look at maybe other experiences that happened when you had shocks on schooling on the supply side? Because that's, an unusual thing. Usually with economic crisis, that doesn't happen. But, with wars or natural disasters, that is a phenomenon that happens. Previous pandemic, what do we learn? And also, are there places in the world that have been more successful in addressing what this means? I think that you need to actually bring in brainstorming that's very quick, but at the same time of breadth, to be able to come up with the same sort of like streamlined messages that will make a difference in terms of the outcome.
Absolutely. I do think that just raising this to that level of like this is a crisis at the level of wars and natural disasters that have wiped out capacity for education in countries is a really important point. So Maritza and Angel, I want to give you guys a chance to say just your final thoughts as well before we wrap up.
I just wanted to answer or add a comment to what Nora was saying, that what is it that we need to do? I think we do know what we need to do. I think it's very clear where we need to focus on, but where's the political will, right? To prioritize, at least in El Salvador, when the pandemic happened, there had to be some cuts to some of the government lines, and education was one of the first ones that was cut, and so we know there's a lot of research, there's a lot of evidence that and like you said, there's a lot of other experiences in conflict areas that tells us what has worked and what we can do to help, mitigate some of the negative impacts of COVID-19. But we really need to push and come together, so we, so that the political will, changes and shifts us in the right direction. And maybe that can come from civil society, right? Like it needs to become a priority. We need to be concerned. Because even if all this education is going to this issue of education can affect in the end our entire region and the entire world in the future. So that would be my final message. Thank you.
No, I agree with our colleagues, and thank you for illuminating with your thoughts. Not only what we're doing, but what we can do. And I would say that we need to continue to be inspired by what's working, what children's need, what adolescents need. But I also think that we need to feel the urgency of what it feels to be out of school, what it feels to be deprived from education, and what it must feel to have your social world crumble, your friends, your role models, your mentors, your tutors. And that's not a world we want for children and adolescents, particularly not in our region. So I think, if we wake up to that sense of urgency sooner rather than later, and then, bring in the ideas that we discussed, and of course, partnerships. If there was ever a moment where partnerships, not only with civil society, but at community level, need to happen, is now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Angel, and thank you, Maritza and Nora. This really is kind of a call to keep this conversation going so that we can actually, marshal all of the support and the efforts and channel that in the direction of really building back these education systems in Central America. I put into the chat, and I want to share on the screen how to reach us, and also want to thank Kathy Hall and Caroline Conley for, as I said, being my co-conspirators on this over the past couple of months to bring this together. Also, thank you to all of you who participated in or were interested in the workshop that we held at the beginning of CADF, for those funders who are looking at education as we are. So thank you for your participation in all of this. And with that, I just want to ask you to reach out, and thank you for joining us here, and thank you for joining us at CADF.
En estos 3 días, decenas de panelistas y oradores no solo compartieron con nosotros su experiencia y sus ideas, sino que promovieron un rico intercambio de propuestas para los complejos retos que enfrenta Centroamérica. Y si bien nos hubiera encantado realizar este foro presencial en alguna ciudad centroamericana, como ha sido la tradición antes de la pandemia, la virtualidad también nos dio la gran oportunidad de contar con personas de distintos lugares del mundo que, de no ser por las pantallas, no habrían podido acompañarnos ni enriquecernos con sus diversas perspectivas. En estos escenarios conocimos a las impresionantes jóvenes líderes de Sololá, Guatemala, que están dirigiendo proyectos y convirtiéndose en agentes de cambio. Escuchamos del periodismo independiente sobre su importante papel en la construcción de la democracia y sobre cómo están enfrentando las intimidaciones, el hostigamiento y la censura. Y conocimos ejemplos del uso del arte y la música para generar diálogos y ser catalizadores del cambio. Escuchamos también de representantes de la administración Biden y del Congreso estadounidense sobre el rol de los Estados Unidos en la compleja coyuntura de Centroamérica en cuanto a la migración, la defensa de la democracia, la transparencia y la lucha contra la corrupción. Y también de representantes de Naciones Unidas y de la comunidad internacional sobre acciones y estrategias para proteger y promover los derechos humanos, el Estado de Derecho y la libertad de expresión. Representantes de comunidades rurales e indígenas nos compartieron qué respuestas han generado para el COVID ante las deficiencias de sus gobiernos. Y miembros del sector privado discutieron sobre posibles rutas para una prosperidad económica inclusiva. Abordamos la salud mental de la niñez migrante y las vías para ampliar la migración legal. Hablamos de la resiliencia ambiental, del derecho a la educación, de la defensa de los territorios, de los esfuerzos de la sociedad civil para luchar contra la corrupción y de accionadores procesos de sanación desde el feminismo. Conocimos diversas formas en que las personas y organizaciones han respondido a las adversidades de salud, económicas y amenazas a sus derechos, del increíble papel de la sociedad civil y el alzamiento de su voz a través de los movimientos sociales, del valiente e incansable trabajo de la prensa independiente pese a los ataques, y de las variadas formas en general en que las alianzas en Centroamérica están contribuyendo a sanar y reconstruir. La región enfrenta una coyuntura bastante compleja y desafiante. La pandemia y el paso de 2 huracanes agravaron los desafíos crónicos de pobreza, de desigualdad y resiliencia ambiental. Su institucionalidad democrática, Estado de Derecho y espacios de participación han sufrido serios deterioros. Pero a pesar de estos desafíos, a lo largo de la región vemos una sociedad civil vibrante, activa y resiliente. Líderes y lideresas sociales, activistas, organizaciones y movimientos sociales están innovando y buscando nuevos modelos y enfoques de trabajo, de organización y de alianzas para enfrentar los flagelos de la región. Grupos tradicionalmente invisibilizados están amplificando sus voces y luchando por sus derechos. Ahora más que nunca tenemos una gran oportunidad para generar un mayor diálogo y alianzas intersectoriales y transfronterizas para fortalecer nuestro trabajo colaborativo y colectivo para avanzar en la transformación social que todos y todas deseamos. Este CADF ha sido particularmente rico en temas y abordajes y en diversidad de voces. Reunió a más de 150 panelistas y oradores y en total más de 800 asistentes de 26 países. A través del foro captamos la atención y participación de personas fuera de la región, incluyendo de los Estados Unidos, México, Canadá, Sudamérica, el Caribe, Europa y África. Tantas voces y perspectivas aquí reunidas crearon un ambiente cargado de información y reflexiones profundas, pero también de buena energía y muchísima inspiración para fortalecer el trabajo colaborativo y colectivo en Centroamérica. Para nosotros en la Fundación Internacional de Seattle ha sido un privilegio poder ofrecer esta plataforma virtual que ustedes han llenado y enriquecido con su experiencia y conocimiento. Y esperamos que hayan gozado tanto con este foro como a nosotros nos encantó organizarlo y ser sus anfitriones.
No quisiera terminar sin agradecer a mi equipo en CIF por el arduo trabajo de varios meses que realizó para llevar a cabo el CADF. Todas las personas que conforman la fundación han contribuido al foro de una u otra manera. Quiero agradecer a Paola Hurtado por ser una increíble maestra de ceremonias y quiero especialmente agradecer al organizador oficial del CADF, Nate Moyer, a quien muchos de ustedes ya conocen y sabrán cuán involucrado está con el éxito del foro. Nate, gracias por toda tu dedicación y coordinación. Y agradezco nuevamente a nuestros patrocinadores por confiar en el CADF como un espacio para dar a conocer su trabajo e iniciativas en favor de Centroamérica. Y les agradezco a cada uno y una de ustedes por el tiempo y atención que dedicaron esta semana a la región. Concluyo con la reafirmación de nuestro compromiso de seguir contribuyendo con las iniciativas y las soluciones surgidas desde las organizaciones y los movimientos sociales en Centroamérica en estos momentos tan adversos, pero que también son momentos de mucha unidad y de alianzas que le han permitido a la región mantenerse de pie. Nos llevamos la buena energía y la inspiración que nos anima a seguir trabajando por el desarrollo y las oportunidades en Centroamérica. Gracias a todos y todas por acompañarnos en el CADF 2021. Nos vemos, ojalá de forma presencial y virtual, en el CADF 2022. Hasta pronto.
Adriana, y gracias a ti porque eres nuestra nueva directora ejecutiva y nos has acuerpado en este foro, en esta nueva parte de tu carrera y te habíamos tenido siempre como invitada, pero qué honor tenerte ahora como líder del equipo. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.